it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Nicola Gavey. I first encountered Nicola when I was an undergraduate student many years ago in stage 1, and got to know her and her work much better after I pestered her into agreeing to supervise me for an undergraduate project at stage 3. That's how inspiring she was as a teacher, and how inspiring her work continues to be. Her work is deeply critical, deeply thoughtful, and deeply important. She's had a global impact on the field of feminist psychology that's both theoretical and methodological, but also topical. And she's most well known for her work around sexual coercion and rape, and her 2005 distinguished publication award-winning book, Just Sex, The Cultural Scaffolding of Rape, remains a must-read for anyone interested in gender, sex, sexual coercion, and the trenchant and complex intersections between individual actions and cultural meanings and representation. Over the last year or so, this has become particularly salient in New Zealand with revelations around the so-called roastbusters and so on, as well as much more globally as case after case of mass sexual assault in mundane circumstances are revealed. Nicola's more recent Marsden-funded research project on pornography in the public eye continues her critical interest, and you'll be hearing more about this now as I'm going to stop talking. So please join me in welcoming Nicola.
Kia ora koutou katoa. I'd like to join with Ginny in warmly welcoming all of you here today, and also thank you, Ginny, for that very generous introduction. It's true that Ginny did pester me to supervise a stage 3 research topic many years ago, and it was one of the best decisions I made in agreeing to do that. There are two main purposes for this symposium. Firstly, to inject some new ideas and research into the field of conversation that we can have in New Zealand about gender and sexual politics. And to that end, we're really delighted to be welcoming today our two invited speakers from overseas, Professor Anne Cahill and Professor Michael Flood. Both of these speakers, who we'll introduce properly later, bring original and sophisticated ways of making sense of some of the questions that are facing us in relation to thinking about gender and sexuality. A second purpose of today's symposium is to report back on some aspects of the work that we've been doing as part of this broad project on pornography in the public eye and closely related studies, because while our original aim has been to bring pornography back into a space for critical public discussion, we've seen it as important to make our focus broader than pornography alone. As you'll see in today's program, the work we're presenting considers not only pornography, but also broader representation of gendered and sex bodies, as well as gendered and raced experiences of sexuality, sexualisation and sexual violence, and everyday experiences of sexism and misogyny and rape culture. All of these things are connected. We're also interested in shining a light on people's everyday strategies of political engagement with gender and sexual inequalities and injustices, and the possibilities for resisting or fighting back. I'd like to acknowledge all of the colleagues and students who've been collaborating and contributing to various different aspects of this work. In relation to my talk today, I'll be drawing directly on work that I've done alongside Alec Mtevska, based on her master's thesis research with young men, and work done with Octavia Calder-Dor in the early stages of conceptualising aspects of the project overall, and in interviewing New Zealand key informants, which Jade LeGrice has also been involved with more recently. The overall project, as well as my particular talk, are still works in progress. This talk does focus on pornography, putting me in a slightly awkward position given that I'm wanting to say there are some real issues and actually problems in relation to pornography, but that I'm also wanting to say that we mustn't treat these in isolation or single them out as a sole cause of gendered inequalities and sexual exploitation. One important contextualising point that I need to make at the start is that I'm discussing specifically the kind of mainstream, or what Karen Boyle calls everyday pornography, the kind of pornography that's made predominantly for a straight male audience. So I'll sometimes refer to that as heterosexual pornography or hetero porn, even though strictly speaking it is kind of broader than that, because it will contain scenes of women having sex together and other things that might be somewhat transgressive within a strict definition of heterosexuality. Also, I want to acknowledge that among us here today, there'll be a very wide range of experiences with and knowledge about pornography, as well as views on it. The range of our presentations today will include material that is sensitive, material that is troubling, material that might be, for some people, embarrassing, annoying, painful, upsetting, for all kinds of different reasons. These are topics that we want to bring some serious thinking to, but they are topics that are not possible to keep insulated in a kind of abstract academic bubble. So I do want to acknowledge that at the beginning. Some of this material is hard work. I want to start by explaining a little bit about how I got interested in the subject of pornography. The main thread of my academic work has looked at what I call the cultural scaffolding of rape, mostly in relation to sexual violence by men against women. I've argued that the gendered norms of heterosexuality, the idea that men are and should be sexually initiating and assertive, and women are and should be more passive and responsive, that these norms actually create the cultural conditions of possibility for sexual exploitation of girls and women, and for sexual violence. This is not to say that men's sexual seduction, pressure or coercion of women are the same as rape, not at all, but that if we accept that this gendered arrangement is normal, natural and unproblematic, and or unchangeable, then we are stuck with gendered sexual scripts that too often lead people right up to the brink of sexual violence and beyond. Until about 5 or 6 years ago, I hadn't given much thought at all to the role that pornography might play in reinforcing these kind of gendered heterosexual norms. So some people in the audience might recognise themselves here. I started to get interested when people like Denise Ritchie from Stop Demand started to bring along pornographic magazines to rape awareness events and sort of try and, get us to kind of think about these connections. And students in my courses started choosing to write essays about pornography. And you see Alex, who's presenting later today, in one of these pictures, and Denise, who were presenting at a symposium in 2009. I learned that the nature of everyday pornography had moved on a lot from the images I remembered from the Playboy and Penthouse magazines I'd seen as a teenager in the 1970s. At the same time, it was clear that the accessibility and the volume of pornography had increased immensely since that time. So I want to talk about the content of contemporary pornography, but first I want to say a little bit more about consumption. In these data collected by my colleagues Ginny Brown and Gareth Terry, we get a snapshot of the frequency of pornography consumption, at least among a relatively young New Zealand sample. These data also provide an interesting insight into the gendered pattern of consumption. While some women report using porn regularly and some men report not using it at all, nearly 70% of men said they consumed it regularly or sometimes. By contrast, nearly 60% of women said they did not use it at all. 10 times as many men as women reported consuming it regularly. This picture is consistent with what we were told by young men interviewed by Alex Antevska for her master's thesis. And she'll tell you a bit more about the background to that study when she speaks later on. They strongly endorsed the idea that it was normative for men to watch pornography. As one participant said, "I haven't met a man who doesn't." By default, when they talked about porn, it was mainstream heteroporn they focused on, and they also endorsed the idea that porn was masculine terrain. Another of these men said, well, like we said, porn is catered to males. If anything, the content of mainstream pornography is even more rigidly patterned by gender than its consumption. While the meaning and effects of pornography are highly contested by academics and researchers internationally, everyone appears to agree that the content of mainstream porn is characterised by male sexual dominance and control and female submission. The young New Zealand porn consumers Alex interviewed echoed this observation, agreeing that sexual domination was in pretty much most porn, and it's always the dude dominating the girl. This observation was also confirmed by classification officers from the Office for Film and Literature Classification that Octavia and I interviewed. Sometimes women are portrayed in mainstream pornography as sexually dominant, but this doesn't work in a straightforward reversal of gendered control and domination. The meaning of what is shown in porn and our responses to it are affected by our own gendered and racialised identities and experiences. If you live in a world where you are taught to fear or be cautious of the other sex as potential rapists, and in which you may have had experiences that fit this, then watching a member of your own sex be dominated by someone of the other sex will carry meaning that is different than if you have not had that gendered training or experience. The fact that sexual domination of women in porn echoes the nature of the sexualised violence that we have either experienced directly or know is most likely is probably why women porn consumers interviewed in the US by Farine Parvez described reactions like feeling sick or bursting into tears after watching a scene that looked like forced sex. By stark contrast, one of the male porn consumers Alex interviewed said it was funny to watch a man be dominated by a woman. So even where there is apparent gender reversal, it operates in an entirely different way. As men interviewed by Alex said, either way it is for the male viewer. Another gender dimension of mainstream porn is sexual aggression. In Bridges et al.'s US content analysis of popular pornographic videos from 2004-2005, they sampled the top best-selling and most rented videos from the industry's adult video news list. This gives us a good indication of what popular mainstream pornography looked like 10 years ago, although I think we have to accept that these findings are probably already out of date, given the boundaries of content are continually being pushed, and with most consumers now accessing pornography on the internet for free. They found that physical aggression occurred in 88% of scenes, and verbal aggression occurred in 49% of scenes. Only 10% of scenes they looked at contained no sexual aggression at all. 94% of all acts of aggression were directed against women. This is, as probably some of you will know, this is controversial territory among researchers, however. Variations in the way they define aggression dramatically affect findings. Depending on their definitions and approach, we end up with wildly different estimates of the frequency of sexually aggressive scenes. So in another content analysis of, in this case, best-selling videos in Australia around the same time, Alan McKee found that only 1.9% of scenes contained some form of violence. So it's a dramatic difference in findings. And incidentally, all of those cases were also violence perpetrated by men against women. The main reason for the dramatic difference in these findings is that McKee did not code any acts that appeared to be consensual as violent. So, for example, if a person is being subjected to bondage, domination and sadistic acts but does not appear to avoid what is being done to them, or if a person is being verbally insulted but does not appear to be displeased by that, then those acts were not coded as violence or aggression. The main rationale for this seems to be to avoid miscategorising consensual BDSM, that is, forms of sexual practice where all parties desire, seek and agree to a relation of explicit sexual domination and submission. Within kink communities of practice, there are clear guidelines for how such agreements are made and how consent works. One of the problems, however, with bringing the logic informed by BDSM into interpreting acts in everyday mainstream pornography is that it doesn't take account of how those acts will be regarded by consumers who don't know anything about BDSM. The young men in Alex's interviews responded to violent pornography without any apparent awareness of the rules and complexities of consensual BDSM. I'm not going to speak to these quotes directly, but they show the sort of casual way in which men talked about watching violent pornography, and also kind of a sort of bemusement about that, which I think reveals a lack of kind of understanding of BDSM logics. So they were blasé about it. Whether or not they said they enjoyed male dominance and violence, they would watch it and were detached from it. It was fun, or it was a backdrop that was beside the main point of their pleasure. They readily drew on the notion that women in these videos had chosen to do this work and that they were getting paid for it. As Karen Boyle has discussed, however, the public narratives of female porn performers almost always contain both accounts of agency, empowerment and choice, as well as accounts of exploitation and abuse within the industry. But those aspects of their stories presumably have to be underplayed or ignored by many consumers. One of Alex's interviewees, when asked if they were concerned about pornography being male-dominated and the prospect that women performing in it might not be enjoying herself, he said, "Not at all, not a single smidge, don't give a shit." Other men also talked about how they didn't care or how they actively put any concerns out of their mind. There were some men who found that more difficult to do, and we should acknowledge that, that's the case. The other relevant feature of mainstream heterosexual pornography is the nature of some of the common acts which arguably denigrate and humiliate women. Acts such as ass to mouth or ATM, for instance, in which a man penetrates a woman's anus and then directly puts his penis into her or another woman's mouth. According to Bridges et al.'s content analysis, ATM featured in 41% of scenes in popular pornography. While the young consumers that Alex interviewed regarded ATM as normal and unremarkable in the porn they watched, it is the kind of act that invites divided responses among critics and commentators. So, for instance, last year, an academic reviewer for our paper complained that reference to ass to mouth was tiresome and sensationalist, implying that it would be wrong to assume that it is inherently degrading. I would agree that the meaning of many sexual acts is open to interpretation and dependent on, for example, the context of the encounter or the history of any sexual relationship. Yet some acts, and I think ass to mouth is one of them, require, in my view, a less relativist response. In a pornographic domain where it is always the woman's mouth at the end point of this sequence, I do regard it, in its repetitive gendered form, as both symbolically and materially deeply misogynist. One of the men interviewed by Alex even suggested that some men might find ATM appealing because it provides a sort of buzz from masculine domination. The gendered structure of other common acts also appear to put women in their place. The money shot, for instance, in which a man or men literally or symbolically mark the territory of a woman's body by visibly ejaculating on her body, face or mouth. As the young woman Alex interviewed told us, how else would you finish? One went on to say, we've been watching this since we've 10, the cum shot, so we can't really talk objectively because it's just like how it is. Another act like this, so-called deep throat fellatio, in which a man forcefully thrusts his penis down a woman's throat to the point that she is gagging and her eyes might be tearing up. One of the classification officers we interviewed told us how when she came back to the job after being away for a period of time, she was surprised by a scene like this, so she took it to her supervisors to check if it would be acceptable within the criteria laid out in the New Zealand legislation. And she was told it would be acceptable, that it was pretty much, it was standard now, it was pretty much in everything. The reason I'm detailing, I know it's very early in the morning to be talking about this kind of thing. No time's really a good time, but the reason I'm detailing what I think are some problematic features of mainstream pornography is because I don't know how else we can really grapple with the questions to do with the gender politics and the ethics of porn. I realise that this makes me open to the question that I'm purposefully sensationalising or exaggerating, that I am simply anti-pornography, as I'm sure the reviewer of our paper would suggest. No matter how strongly I state that I do not believe that pornography is inherently problematic. To return for a moment to the point I got involved in this research, my interest really crystallised in the issues in 2010 when I watched the mini scandal unfold around Shane Jones's use of his ministerial credit card to pay for pornographic movies in his hotel room. In the media response, we saw clearly how the issue of pornography inhabited, and perhaps still inhabits, a liminal zone in New Zealand society. There was some trace of stigma. He spoke of shame and he was teasingly referred to as the minister of porn. But the most prominent response to the pornographic dimension of his indiscretion was silence. Into this vacuum, Shane Jones's own response drew on a logic of normalisation, that is, just part of a healthy masculine sexuality, a red-blooded, robust dude, pretty much mirroring the response that the young men interviewed by Alex, and consistent with Ginny and Gareth's data on the prevalence of men's consumption. The responses of his party leaders, when asked to account for his transgression, carefully refused to take up the issue of the type of film he was charging on his ministerial credit card. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that Jones should have been condemned for what we know is a normative practice among men in particular. But it nevertheless seems striking how reluctant people are, or at least were, to hold on to pornography as an issue that we can talk about, beyond sort of salacious joking and discomfort. In the case of Shane Jones's outing as a red-blooded dude porn consumer, no public conversations I saw actually picked up on the pornographic element as a sort of launching pad for serious discussion. In the interviews that Octavia and I did the following year with key informants working in areas such as sexuality, gender issues, education, health and so on, we found many and varied views on pornography. As conversations unfolded, I don't think there was anyone we spoke to, and we in the end spoke to about 40 people, who seamlessly subscribed either to one side or the other of the polarising pro versus anti-pornography dichotomy. that characterises debates in the UK and the United States. Many of the people we spoke to admitted that they'd not given a lot of thought to pornography in recent years. It was by and large a dormant issue. With the exception of Denise Ritchie from Stop Demand, none of those who were inclined to be critical of pornography had taken it up as an issue to campaign against. Even when people voiced discomfort or disagreement with aspects of pornography, mostly they indicated that they would be unlikely to articulate those in public. Amongst those who expressed liberal tolerance, some implied that this was the kind of approach that one should have, or even if it might not come naturally. So a sexual health nurse, for instance, said, "I try really hard not to think of pornography as negative." Those who were initially upbeat and inclined to emphasise a positive disposition towards porn almost always were, as it turned out later in the conversation, concerned about power issues and about the representation and treatment of women in mainstream porn, or about power and control issues more generally. Just as those who were inclined to be critical almost always confirmed when asked that they had no objection to films of explicit sex per se. What concerned them usually was the way that sex was represented, and in particular the way that women were portrayed. More generally in New Zealand, the clear exception to liberal tolerance or silence seems to be reserved for child pornography. Again, while there is very little debate about child pornography in New Zealand, it is in some ways more visible as a subject because it is strictly censored and it is policed. And there is, in the public domain at least, no real argument against that. So the default response to child pornography is not tolerance, it is actually strongly negative. But beyond this widely agreed exception, tolerance and refusal to judge people and their sexual preferences are of course some of the better dispositions and values in our society. In relation to pornography generally, there is very good reason to approach it as a broad field of practice and text with an open mind, especially if we're interested in social justice, gender, sexual and other forms of equality. Pornography is a diverse genre. At its most basic, it simply means sexually explicit material that is intended to sexually arouse. And the gender politics of pornography are far from unidimensional or obvious. As we saw in the sex wars in the 1980s, feminists were sharply divided over porn. Did it represent the epitome of denigration and oppression of women, as some feminists argued? Or did it represent, at last, the possibility for endorsing female sexual pleasure, a sort of liberation after decades of more strict regulation of female sexuality and denial of female sexual pleasure and agency? Feminists like Linda Williams and Lynn Siegel, for instance, were among those who wrote optimistically in the early 1990s about the possibilities for new trends in pornography to contribute to the decentering of heteronormative norms in ways that would benefit women. Many feminists are rightly wary about seeking any prescription against porn and how that can help to reinforce restrictive stereotypes of women as sexually disinterested and passive. And those are the very same stereotypes, I would argue, that feed into the cultural conditions of possibility for rape. So this is a very important concern. There are other good reasons to be cautious about any absolute moral judgment against pornography, and in particular when the state is involved through censorship and policing, and when moves against pornography are aligned with powerful religious and socially conservative forces. As numerous authors and activists have explained, those who have been most likely to face the punitive consequences of censorship are those who are already most marginal and vulnerable, including queer and transgender people. All of these concerns are very important and I think must be held in clear view in developing a critical yet inclusive response to pornography. It's these kinds of considerations that were prominent during the feminist sex wars in the United States in the 1980s. The influential American feminist anthropologist Gail Rubin, for instance, argued that pornography consumption was marginalised in the US culture at the time. It was one of the categories of sexuality that was denigrated as bad, abnormal and unnatural, alongside casual sex, non-procreative, unmarried sex, homosexuality, masturbation, sadomasochistic and cross-generational sex. Rubin claimed that anti-porn literature scapegoats an unpopular sexual minority. Her drive towards a pluralistic sexual ethics was premised, at least implicitly, on calling into question the coercive power of normativity to stigmatise and dispossess those whose sexualities or sexual preferences were on the fringes or beyond the pale of respectability. Yet the contemporary social landscape of New Zealand in 2015 is very different from the social landscape of Reagan's United States or Thatcher's Britain in the 1980s. Pornography no longer occupies this marginal cultural space, at least not in any straightforward sense. It is no longer the preserve of sexual minorities. To the contrary, as we've seen, the consumption of pornography is now mainstream, particularly for men, and especially for young men. In the New Zealand popular cultural imagination, watching porn is now more likely to be associated with sexual normalcy, naturalness and health, at least for males, than it is with sleaze. As a sex therapist told us, the cultural norm has shifted. It's kind of accepted. People watch porn. We are left with the legacy of the kind of permissive individualism of this era, the early kind of neoliberal era in the early 1980s. Annette King and Phil Goff drew on neoliberal values of individual freedom and privacy to delegitimise any interest in the pornographic specificities of Joan's case. This familiar trope that what individuals do in the privacy of their own bedroom is their choice has come up repeatedly in our research and in wider conversations around pornography. At face value within New Zealand culture, it seems progressive and liberating. But why is it insufficient and flawed as a response? In debates about pornography, this trope functions to elevate the rights of the individual in a way that diverts critical attention away from scrutiny of the broader cultural and political domain, and away from considering the implications of the repetition and normalisation of male sexual domination of women, as well as raw misogyny in some cases and racist depictions in some cases as well. Deferring from any kind of critique of individual choices, therefore, functions to tolerate and reinforce sexism, misogyny and racism. Some academics argue that pornography is only a text, that we are mostly agentic and savvy, able to watch it in private for our own personal sexual satisfaction, end of story. They insist that it is naive to assume a direct causal relationship between, for example, watching violent porn and acting violently oneself. I completely agree that this kind of monkey see, monkey do model of the effects of pornographic consumption would be overly simplistic. And I think even many anti-pornography campaigners would probably agree with that too. The huge irony, however, is that while they critique what they consider to be naive, what they call a behaviourist understanding of media effects, they actually share in common with the approach they critique an overly individualised understanding of the formation of human experience and behaviour, and the relationship between the individual and the social. It is equally simplistic, surely, to assume that we stand outside of our cultural context and that we are not influenced by the norms and values transmitted in the social texts that we and our peers consume. There is anecdotal evidence accumulating that some young people's expectations of sex and bodies are being informed by pornography, as we saw in a few kind of poignant case studies in Marie Crabb and Dave Corlett's documentary Love and Sex in an Age of Pornography. Michael Flood has suggested that pornography might provide a sort of sexist education for young men, something that he might talk more about this afternoon. Any former students and courses I've taught will know that my favourite concept is Michel Foucault's notion of pouvoir savoir, or power knowledge. As Gayatri Spivak explains, pouvoir in French means not only power, but also the verb to be able. So the pouvoir part of pouvoir savoir carries with it a sense of can-do-ness, according to Spivak. Pouvoir savoir, being able to do something only as you're able to make sense of it. The discourses that circulate in a particular time and place provide vocabularies of making sense of the world. They provide frameworks of meaning that enable some possibilities for desires, identities and behaviours, for example, and constrain other possibilities. Thus, any cultural text or artefact is not just a reflection of the feelings and thoughts of people within a culture or a community. It is at the same time constitutive of people's ideas, desires, hopes and aspirations. That is, it shapes them. Pornography therefore provides ways of seeing ourselves as gendered sexual subjects. It provides ideas for what sex is and should be and so on. Of course, it's not alone in that. Television, literature, pop psychology, religious texts, medical experts, advice columns, so on and so on and so on, all kind of jostle for influence in telling us how to live. So it's not alone there, but it is one of many texts that has that role. In a recently published UK study on on young people's expectations and experiences of anal sex, the authors concluded that the narratives of the 16 to 18-year-olds they interviewed normalised coercive, painful and unsafe anal sex, heterosex. There were marked gender differences, with pleasure and achievement expected for men but not women, and risks of pain and reputational risks expected for women but not men. In line with many other studies based on with young people about heterosexual sex more generally, they found that a sense of mutuality and consent for anal sex were not always a priority for young men. One of the reasons given by the young people for having anal sex was that men wanted to copy what they saw in pornography. The authors themselves almost lean towards minimising this influence. They're careful to point out that when young people's accounts were unpacked in more detail, pornography was only one element in a more complex set of reasons, all of which were consistent with what we know about the dynamics of coercive heterosexual sex more generally. Thus, while pornography is not the sole cause of coercive anal sex, it may be implicated in offering new practices which can become new imperatives. In this case, as we see, with unequal gendered effects. While the authors were careful to note that they do not believe that mutually pleasurable anal sex is not possible among young people in this age group, they said that mutuality and women's pleasure were often absent in the narratives. And their absence, they said, is not only unremarked and unchallenged, but even seems to be expected by many young people. This is an example, I would suggest, that illustrates why a liberal deference to individual choice is so flawed as a response to private habits. It is an example where pornography seems to be helping to shape or reshape an inequitable and exploitative cultural landscape for sex and for gender relations more generally. And the problem is that the girl who suffers coerced, painful anal intercourse is probably not the person who has made the choice to consume porn. Pornography is not the cause of this exploitation and abuse, but it provides new territory for it, and it helps to reinforce deeply sexist sexual treatment of women and girls. When Alan McKee decides to not categorise so-called consensual aggression as violence, what he misses is that the representation of women ostensibly agreeing to be treated badly is itself a problem. He appears to argue that if women don't initially resist and attempt to fight back, thereby problematically reinforcing old rape myths, then that's just fine. I think it is possible that I would agree with him if there was no pattern, no predictability to the gendered arrangement of power, if women were just as likely in porn and in real life to be sexually aggressive, and if men were just as likely to be raped by women as women are by men. But given that is not the case, either in porn or in real life, then is not this kind of pornography as a body of work irresponsible and unethical? Wanting to problematise a permissive response to porn does not mean prohibiting choice. It is not the same as saying you should not have a choice, but saying that a person's individual choice is never sufficient for grounding an ethical argument. As the research on young people's experiences and views of anal sex shows, individual choices have direct relational effect on others. Our lives are interconnected. So, for example, if my experience of sexuality is shaped by watching sexist pornography, then that does have the potential to affect not just me, but my sexual partners as well, not always with their consent. Moreover, when representations or enactments in mainstream pornography so repetitively stereotype and denigrate women as a whole class of people, then this makes it a social issue, not just a matter of personal taste and individual consumption. The ethics of pornography therefore have to extend beyond issues of production and consumption narrowly defined. What do we think about watching another person be denigrated and dominated for our individual sexual pleasure? Is sex so sacrosanct, is pleasure so sacrosanct that they have the right to exist no matter what the implications for the other? And particularly when this route to sexual pleasure becomes normalised, how can we treat this as unremarkable? Anne Cahill, work is invaluable here, and I'm not going to talk about her work because she is going to talk to us all about that. But I think it helps us to think through with more sophistication and nuance what is wrong with certain ways that certain people are treated. Judith Butler's work in her 2005 book, Giving an Account of Oneself, is also helpful here. She outlines a new sense of ethics grounded in what she argues is our primary and irreducible relation to others, which she says is a precondition of ethical responsiveness. Central to her argument is the claim that the self is fundamentally opaque. That is, we can never know ourselves completely, and we can only ever know ourselves in relation to the social world in which we exist. Two things follow from this. Firstly, it provides a basis for calling into question references to individuals' desires, pleasures, needs, and so on, in unquestioned and unproblematized, to treating those things as unquestioned and unproblematized givens that act as warrants for consumptive practices. Instead, these things would have to be weighted against consideration of the way these things might affect others, including how they might provide modes of recognition for others. Secondly, because the social norms through which we are constituted are historically contingent, they're always changing, social critique is essential to ethics, and thus the boundary between ethics and politics becomes blurred. And I'm sorry that that's rushing over what I think are some really important points that need to be unpacked in more detail, and this is kind of the work in progress that I'm hoping to do on my sabbatical. What do I do on my holidays? I want to finish by touching on somewhat of a qualification on what I've been talking about today. The binary form of pro versus anti-politics around pornography that we see played out so viciously in some places not only pushes commentators towards hyperbolic claims or claims that are so dispassionate that they're disconnected from the real nature of people's lives, but they seem counterproductive to meaningful change. The endpoint we might be seeking for any change is not greater censorship, and neither is it to demonise pornography in the broadest sense. Rather, it is to encourage more dialogue, more questioning, and a wider range of issues and voices to be included in the conversations, and to allow for recognition of ethical trouble. A move towards what the American political philosopher Michael Sandel would refer to as a politics of moral engagement, a politics less oriented to individual self-interest and more to the common good. Given what we've discussed about the contemporary content of mainstream pornography and the normativeness of its consumption, it is essential, I think, to bring it back into view as an object of critique. But at the same time, we can't afford to focus solely on pornography, to isolate it and to fixate on it. In November last year, the French philosopher Alain Badiou gave a talk at Auckland University entitled In Search of the Lost Real. His concerns are about a completely different subject, to do with how the true real of the world has become reduced to and confused with economics. He talked about how scandals give us a glimpse into what is really going on. When a scandal is uncovered, we get to see a small part of the real, that which is generally obscured and invisible. For example, the corruption that becomes inherent in capitalism when profit is the bottom line and making as much money as possible is the norm. Scandals are useful for the establishment, Badiou said, because they present a small bit of the real as an exception to the real itself. In this sense, they are deceiving. They allow us to fixate on what we can pretend is a terrible aberration, while the more systemic problems and everyday workings of society remain invisible to us. I know this seems like quite a tangent to talking about pornography, but hearing this made me think about how pornography could come to function in a similar way as the scandal that gives us a glimpse of real gendered sexual politics, but at the same time is treated like the exception. The problem with this, of course, is treating pornography as an exception to the rule of, for example, an exception to healthy sexuality, would further help to obscure the broader scaffolding of gender and sexual relations that it sits within, is produced by, and in turn helps to reproduce, and which are themselves threaded with gender dynamics of power that continue to be limiting and sometimes harmful. So in conclusion, we do need to expose the sexism, racism and misogyny within everyday pornography and make this a subject of ethical deliberation and interrogation, particularly because it is so widely consumed, so normatively condoned and so removed from critical public gaze, in New Zealand at least. Yet we must not treat it as an exception to the wider fields of gender and sexual relations, which also remain marked by sexism, racism and misogyny. To do so, I think, would be to risk reinforcing the status quo and help deceive us about the broad and mundane nature of the problems that exist in this area. Thank you.
When we talk about pornography as this narrow activity within the boundaries of the bedroom, for example, how does that limit our perception of pornography that is normalised within a day-to-day context? Whether we're talking about Ralph Lauren billboards that sexualise bodies, or Game of Thrones that normalises rape, or page 3 of The Sun, or so on and so forth. And how does that limit our discussion around that?
I mean, I think I'm not sure if I'm answering exactly what you're intending your question to be, but I think that that's a very important point to make those broader connections. I think it's Gail Dines, who's an anti-pornography campaigner, has pointed out that there's really no soft pornography anymore because it's all been kind of, mainstreamed. So I would argue that all of those kind of things, Game of Thrones, billboards, advertising, Mills and Boon, they're all part of the same problem in terms of constituting forms of feminine and masculine sexuality that set us up for inequitable and potentially harmful relationships.
Is this one? About the research you were looking at was about heterosexual pornography. Is research also being done on gay pornography? I've just worked as a counsellor with the gay community and really been concerned with male gay relationships and how they're portrayed, and the expectations of young male gay guys coming through the system who seem to have a lot of these same expectations about lots of power dynamics and pain and discomfort, and a lot of quite disturbing stuff coming through that seems even stronger amongst gay pornography than heterosexual pornography. So just wondering what research has been done into that.
We've sort of tried to make our focus around heterosexual pornography for various reasons, but I think, so I guess I'm saying that because I haven't really looked into it in as much detail as I probably would need to. But I think it's quite a sort of delicate question, because I think it's one thing, it's kind of much easier for me as a heterosexual woman to critique heterosexual pornography. It's so normative, it's kind of dominant culture, so it's a very easy thing for me to do. But gay pornography, for me to critique that, it's already kind of a marginalised practice, and so it's kind of politically more sensitive. In terms of what I've been told about gay pornography, I've kind of heard some of the opposite of that. That, for example, when we talked to the censors, they said a lot of the gay pornography they saw was much less. It had a much less kind of domination. It's sort of obviously it doesn't have a gendered domination in the same obvious way, and there was sort of more mutuality, and also that it's much better around things like safer sexual practices, for example, using condoms. So that has been said by quite a few people that within gay pornography there is a lot more gay pornography that is kind of more equitable, or for want of a better word. But I have also spoken to people who have said that yes, we may also, gay sexual health research have said, yes, we may also kind of want to start looking at some of the power dynamics that are going on in gay male pornography as well. So, sorry, it's kind of not a great answer. But again, it's equally controversial. I mean, there's a whole new academic field of porn studies, and within that area, it's quite difficult to ask any questions about sort of critically examining some of these things without being kind of just written off as anti-pornography and therefore not having anything valuable to say at all.
Thank you very much for that. I found that really interesting, and I really agree with you that these are really important conversations for us to be having. One thing that I was wondering when I was listening is, how do we have these conversations without silencing and marginalising the voices of women and men who are involved in the porn industry themselves. And I guess this relates to my own experiences doing research with sex workers, and often these debates, their voices are really marginalised, and I just wondered what your view is on how we do have this conversation but ensure that that doesn't happen, ensure that their voices are heard.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's also, I think that we just need to do a whole lot to sort of open out the kind of space for conversations at the moment, because at the moment it's like, what do we hear from, it's so kind of controversial even what we listen to in those voices. So, for example, in David Corlett and Marie Crabb's documentary, they interview some women who perform in pornography, and men actually, and it's quite interesting and revealing. Yeah, that's been kind of critiqued as kind of isolating problematic dimensions by some people. So it's very complex, and I think the more that we can kind of open it up, the more kind of diverse, kind of different kind of experiences can come into it. I mean, like Karen Boyle's work, which has looked at public narratives around, what female porn performers have talked about their own experience, how kind of mixed they are, and how, if you're an anti-pornography campaigner, you just want to listen to the exploitation and abuse, but if you're kind of a pornography producer, you just want to draw attention to their empowerment and choice and agency. So it's also being able to hold that kind of those dilemmas and contradictions, and think through how we kind of theorise around that. It's challenging, but it's important. Thank you.
What do you mean by mainstream pornography, and how does it relate to like the YouTube sites that are prolific now and lots of more amateur kind of videos, and how does that inform your research?
Well, the studies that I was citing were using, I guess they were done before that was really available. So one of the kind of difficult things about this kind of doing research in this area is that what's happening in the field is changing so rapidly that any research that happens is out of date. But just a couple of points about that. What people have said about even some of the amateur pornography, while it may not have violence, and there's a lot of pornography that doesn't have violence or aggression or anything like that, there is still a gender dominant submission dynamic in it. So it still kind of replicates the basic gendered binary. Still quite conservative in the kind of heteronormative roles that men and women are offered. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's also potentially a loaded question, because some of the pornography researchers who are more interested in kind of a more positive view of pornography would claim that that's what a lot of people are watching now, and that they're not watching the violent, aggressive, dominating, more explicitly dominating pornography. But I think Alex's interviews showed that men are watching everything. Men who consume pornography, they have broad taste. They're watching everything. They're watching the amateur stuff as well as quite violent stuff. But some of there's a lot of pornography that's interesting. There's a lot of pornography. Pornography does have the potential to actually disrupt heteronormative binaries in ways that are really transgressive and really liberating for men and women. So I should end on that note. But there's not much of it, I don't think.